A millionaire CEO thought he had everything, until three identical little boys asked his business partner for spare change, and were kicked out like trash. That moment changed everything. Nathan Rivers was the kind of man people rarely said no to. He was a self-made millionaire, the CEO of a booming real estate empire that spanned both coasts, and his name was whispered in boardrooms and magazine covers alike with a mixture of awe and quiet resentment. He had charm, power, discipline, and a stare that could silence a room. On the surface, he had it all. And yet, anyone who truly knew him, if such a person still existed, would have said the same thing: Nathan Rivers felt nothing. Not anymore. Whatever had once softened him had been buried under years of deals, contracts, losses, and an armor of calculated detachment. He moved through the world like a man with no past and no particular interest in a future beyond his profit margin. That afternoon was like countless others. He was seated at a private table on the shaded terrace of one of his boutique hotels in Miami, sipping a chilled glass of Sauvignon Blanc and discussing an upcoming international development project with his longtime business partner, Garrett Vale. The sky was cloudless, the ocean glittered just beyond the promenade, and expensive perfume drifted past with every passing guest. Nathan leaned back in his chair, clean-shaven and composed, dressed in a pale linen suit tailored to perfection. His dark hair was swept back, not a strand out of place, and behind his sunglasses, his sharp blue eyes watched the world with disinterest. Garrett, meanwhile, was loudly dissecting their next acquisition target, gesturing with one hand and checking his phone with the other. Then, out of nowhere, three small voices interrupted the illusion of serenity. Nathan looked up, slightly annoyed, to see three boys standing in front of their table. They looked around 6 years old, nearly identical, with tousled blonde hair and striking blue eyes that mirrored his own so precisely it made his chest tighten for a moment, though he couldn't explain why. Their clothes were worn and too big, like they had been handed down through too many siblings. One of the boys, the tallest by just an inch or two, stepped forward and said softly, "Excuse me, do you have anything to spare? Our mom is really sick. We just need a little money." Garrett's reaction was instant and brutal. He stood up, pointed sharply down the terrace, and said, "Go on, get out of here. This isn't the place for beggars." The words cut through the afternoon air like a slap. The boys didn't cry. They didn't argue. The taller one simply lowered his eyes and took his brothers by the hand. As they turned to leave, Nathan felt something unexpected unfold inside him. A kind of static, a hum just beneath his ribs. He watched them walk away, their shoulders stiff with the effort of not appearing hurt or embarrassed, and for the first time in as long as he could remember, he couldn't stay seated. "Sit down," he told Garrett quietly, without looking at him. Then he stood up, dropped a crisp bill on the table, and followed the boys. He didn't have a plan. He didn't know what he would say. All he knew was that those three small faces had shaken something loose in him that had been locked away for years. Something that didn't care about spreadsheets or quarterly returns or the next luxury development in Dubai. Something that felt an awful lot like conscience. Nathan caught up with the boys just as they were turning a corner off the promenade, their small hands still linked tightly together. They hadn't run, they walked with the kind of quiet dignity that unsettled him more than if they'd burst into tears or bolted into traffic. He slowed his pace as he approached, not wanting to frighten them, suddenly aware of how tall he must seem, how sharply dressed, how far removed he looked from their world. The tallest boy noticed him first and instinctively stepped in front of the other two, his narrow shoulders squared as if to shield them from whatever might come next. "I'm not here to yell," Nathan said, his voice calmer than he felt. "I just want to talk." The boy didn't answer right away. His eyes, almost unnervingly steady for a child so young, studied Nathan as if trying to measure his sincerity. Finally, he gave a small nod. Nathan crouched down to their level, resting his forearms on his knees, and for the first time saw clearly just how thin they were, knees poking through fabric, shoes too tight or too loose, fingernails lined with dirt. But their faces were clean, and their hair, though messy, looked like someone had tried to comb it that morning. These weren't children used to being on the streets. They were children who'd been forced there by something recent, something urgent. "My name is Nathan," he said. "I don't want anything from you. I just want to know if you're okay." The tallest one answered. "I'm Lucas. This is Liam. That's Logan." He didn't mention their last name. He didn't have to. Nathan nodded, careful not to react too strongly to the names, though something about them sank into his chest like a weight. "You said your mom is sick." Lucas gave a short nod. "She hasn't gotten out of bed for 2 days. We tried calling the number on the paper she gave us, but no one picked up. We didn't know what else to do." "Do you have other family?" "No," Lucas said simply. "Just her. And us." Nathan felt a sharp pull in his chest, something that only deepened when Liam stepped slightly closer to his brother, his thumb tucked into his mouth, his eyes wide and searching. Logan looked tired, as if he could fall asleep right there on the sidewalk, but he clung tightly to Liam's shirt like it was the only stable thing in the world. "Are you hungry?" Nathan asked. They didn't answer with words, but the way Liam's eyes flicked toward a cafe across the street told him everything. He stood and gestured toward the corner. "Come with me. Just to eat, that's all." Lucas hesitated. "We're not allowed to go places with strangers." Nathan appreciated that. "You're right. You shouldn't. But this place is just across the street. You can sit by the window the whole time. You don't even have to talk to me if you don't want to." After another long pause, Lucas finally nodded. "Okay." The four of them crossed the street in silence. Inside the cafe, the boys chose the booth furthest from the crowd, closest to the window. Nathan ordered them grilled cheese sandwiches, fruit, and juice, then sat at the far end of the booth, giving them space. They ate slowly at first, as if not quite convinced it was real, but then hunger overtook hesitation. As they ate, Nathan watched them and realized he hadn't felt this alert, this tuned in years. They weren't like other kids. Or maybe they were exactly like other kids, and he had just forgotten. When the food was gone, Lucas leaned back and looked at Nathan carefully. "Why did you come after us?" Nathan didn't lie. "Because something about you felt familiar." Lucas looked unconvinced but didn't press further. "Our mom's name is Emily," he said. "She's really nice. But she's not okay right now." The name hit Nathan like a punch, though he didn't let it show. Emily. It couldn't be the same Emily. Not after all these years. Not here. Not like this. "Do you know your address?" he asked, his voice steady. Lucas nodded and took out a wrinkled slip of paper from his pocket. It had an address written in shaky handwriting. Nathan took it, glanced at it, then looked at them. "I'll take you home," he said. "And if she needs help, we'll get her help. I promise." Lucas stared at him, and for a second, Nathan thought he might say no. But then Logan yawned, leaned against Lucas's side, and the eldest boy simply nodded. In the back of his mind, something had already started to click into place. Too many coincidences. Too many things that felt like fate. He didn't believe in fate. But this wasn't chance. He knew it. He just didn't know yet how much this moment was about to rewrite everything he thought he knew about his life. The building was older than Nathan expected, worn brick, rusted metal railings, and a broken intercom buzzer that hadn't worked in years. He had seen poverty before, of course, but from a distance, in reports, in philanthropic pitches, in areas his company quietly gentrified. This was different. This was real. The boys led him down a narrow set of exterior stairs to a basement apartment that smelled of mildew and damp concrete. The moment they stepped inside, the air changed. It was heavy, close, filled with the quiet desperation of too many long days and longer nights. There was no light on inside, just the muted gray of late afternoon filtering through a single, cracked window. The space was small, one room that served as bedroom, living area, and kitchen all at once. A curtain hung where a door should have been. Folded clothes sat in neat piles on a crate that served as a dresser. There was evidence of care here, of someone trying to hold things together. But it wasn't enough. "Mom?" Lucas called softly. There was no answer. He crossed the room and knelt beside a tattered couch where a woman lay curled beneath a thin blanket. Her skin was pale, her cheeks hollow, her lips dry and cracked. She didn't move. Nathan stepped forward, cautiously, and saw her face for the first time. His breath caught. It was her. Emily James. He hadn't seen her in nearly 7 years, not since that one last night in Los Angeles when they'd argued about everything and nothing, and she'd walked out without another word. He'd assumed she'd moved on with her life, maybe married, maybe left the city for something quieter. He never imagined this. Never imagined her sick and alone in a basement apartment, with 3 children that looked far too much like him for it to be coincidence. "Emily," he said quietly, almost not expecting a response. She stirred slightly, eyes fluttering open for a moment. Her gaze was unfocused, lost in fever. But then it sharpened, just for a second, and found him. Recognition flickered there, faint, confused, but real. "Nathan?" Her voice was barely a whisper. He knelt beside her, unsure of what to do, unsure how to breathe. "I'm here," he said. "You need help." Her lips moved, but the words were slurred. "Boys, are they safe?" "They're fine," he said quickly. "They're with me." She tried to sit up, but her body gave out. Nathan caught her gently, easing her back onto the cushions. She was burning with fever. Her pulse was too fast. He turned to Lucas, who stood a few feet away, arms wrapped tightly around Liam and Logan. "When did this start?" 3 days ago, Lucas answered. She was dizzy. Then she fell. "We thought she'd get better." "She needs a doctor," Nathan said. "Now." He pulled out his phone and called for an ambulance, giving the address and her symptoms with practiced clarity. He didn't think about cost or paperwork. He didn't think about anything except that the woman lying in front of him might die if he didn't act fast enough. While they waited, he moved around the room with quiet purpose. He found a half-empty bottle of medicine by the sink, expired. A torn calendar on the wall marked with "Wick" and "Clinic" in faded pen. There were signs everywhere, of struggle, of survival, of someone doing everything she could with almost nothing. When the paramedics arrived, Nathan stepped back but didn't leave. He stayed as they checked her vitals, loaded her onto the stretcher, and took her away. He promised the boys he'd follow the ambulance, and they trusted him, just like that. It stunned him, how easily they reached for his hands, how naturally they stayed close to him in the hospital waiting room later that night. Hours passed. A doctor finally came out to tell him that Emily was stable, but severely dehydrated and malnourished, with an untreated infection that had nearly gone septic. Another day, and she might not have made it. Nathan thanked the doctor, but the words tasted dry. What he really wanted to do was scream, to rage at himself for not knowing, for not looking, for not being there. But there would be time for that later. That night, back at his penthouse, the 3 boys fell asleep in the guest room, curled up close to each other, still too quiet for children their age. Nathan sat in his living room, the city skyline blinking beyond the glass, and tried to process the truth. Emily had never told him. Never reached out. And yet, the resemblance was undeniable. The timing, the names, the eyes, they were his sons. And he had no idea what to do next. Nathan barely slept that night. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Emily's pale face on that worn-out couch, the way her lips barely moved when she asked if the boys were safe. The sterile lights of the hospital, the weight of the doctor's words, the sound of the boys' small feet echoing in his hallway, they repeated in his mind like a film reel he couldn't pause. At dawn, he found himself standing at the edge of the guest room doorway, watching the three boys sleep. Lucas had taken the middle, as if instinctively shielding the other two. Liam clutched a blanket in his fist, and Logan, the smallest, had turned sideways in his sleep and was pressed up against his brother's side. They looked peaceful now, but even in rest, Nathan could sense the strain beneath their stillness. These were children who had learned too early not to ask for too much. Later that morning, he made a call to a private clinic for a DNA test. It felt almost clinical, necessary, yes, but still cold. And yet, it was the only way to confirm what his heart had already begun to suspect. The wait was unbearable. In the meantime, Nathan tried to function. He made them breakfast, or rather attempted to: burnt toast, cold eggs, juice poured too full. The boys didn't complain. They ate with quiet gratitude that twisted something sharp in his gut. They didn't ask to go home. They didn't cry for their mother. Instead, they followed him from room to room with quiet curiosity, asking only small questions: where the bathroom was, if they could watch cartoons, if the beds were always this soft. Over the next few days, Nathan's entire life shrank to the size of their needs. He took emergency calls from investors while Liam tugged at his sleeve and asked what preferred stock meant. He stepped out of meetings to read bedtime stories and answered emails with Logan asleep in his lap. The penthouse transformed: couch cushions became forts, conference tables became puzzle stations, and the silence he had once cherished was replaced with laughter, shouting, and sometimes crying. Nathan was exhausted, but he had never felt more awake. When the DNA results arrived, he sat down alone in his study to open the envelope. He didn't need it anymore. He already knew. But seeing the words on paper, biological father, 99.99% match, hit him with a finality that no intuition could match. His hand trembled slightly as he set the paper down. There it was. Undeniable. The three boys asleep down the hall were his sons. Not maybe. Not possibly. His. He thought he might cry. But instead, a strange calm settled over him, the kind that comes when a storm ends and all that's left is the wreckage, and the chance to rebuild. For a long time, he just sat there, the silence pressing against his thoughts. He thought about Emily, about the way she used to laugh with her whole body, how fiercely she had once believed in him. He thought about how he had thrown it all away for ambition. He hadn't even known she was pregnant. And now, after all those years, she had ended up half-conscious in a basement apartment, and their sons had come to him not because they knew him, but because they had nowhere else to go. Later that evening, as he tucked them into bed, Logan asked, "Are we staying here again?" Nathan nodded, unable to find his voice. Liam yawned and said, "Your house is big. We don't need that many rooms." And then Lucas, quiet as ever, met his gaze and asked, "Are you our dad now?" The question stopped him cold. There were so many ways he could have answered it. But none of them felt right. So he sat on the edge of the bed, rested a hand on Lucas's shoulder, and said simply, "I was always supposed to be." And for the first time, Lucas smiled. The official decision came faster than Nathan anticipated. The hospital social worker, a woman named Dana with tired eyes but a kind voice, scheduled a meeting with him just 5 days after Emily was admitted. She thanked him for stepping in, said the boys had been remarkably calm and well-adjusted considering the circumstances, and then handed him a stack of paperwork. Guardianship. Temporary at first, pending full evaluation. Standard protocol. Still, the words caught in Nathan's throat as he read them. He wasn't being asked to babysit anymore. This was a choice. A responsibility. A line drawn in permanent ink. He signed without hesitation, though his heart pounded the entire time. Once the pen lifted from the paper, everything shifted. There would be no going back to his old life. No quiet weekends. No endless workdays. No polite excuses. From this point forward, 3 little boys, 3 actual human lives, would look to him for stability, protection, love. He wasn't sure he had any of those things to give. But he had already given them everything he had without realizing it: his attention, his time, his heart. That afternoon, he visited Emily in the hospital. She was stronger now, sitting up in bed, her face no longer ghostly. Her voice still carried the scratch of sickness, but it was steadier, more grounded. She looked at him when he walked in, not with surprise, but with resignation and something else too. Relief, maybe. Fear. Gratitude. He couldn't tell. "I thought you might not come back," she said quietly, eyes fixed on the edge of the bed. Nathan sat down, his fingers loosely laced together. "I never should have left in the first place." Emily gave a tired smile, one that didn't reach her eyes. "That's not how I remember it. You chose your world. I just stepped out of it." He didn't argue. Because she was right. He had chosen ambition, control, distance. And now the consequences of that choice sat at home playing with Legos in a penthouse that used to echo with silence. "They're amazing," he said instead. "All 3 of them." "They're tough," she replied. "They had to be." There was a long pause, filled only by the soft beeping of the monitors beside her bed. Emily finally looked at him, her eyes bright but tired. "Are you keeping them because you feel guilty? Or because you want them?" He didn't answer right away. The question wasn't cruel. It was honest. She had every right to ask. He leaned forward slightly, elbows on his knees, and looked her in the eyes. "I didn't even know they existed a week ago," he said. "And now I can't imagine life without them. It's not about guilt. It's about belonging. They're mine. They feel like mine. I want to do this. Even if I'm terrible at it. Even if I screw it all up." Emily's lips trembled, just slightly. She didn't cry. She simply nodded and whispered, "Good. Because I can't. Not yet. I'm not ready to be their mother again." Nathan didn't try to convince her otherwise. He understood. Healing takes more than medicine. It takes space, safety, time. He reached for her hand, held it gently, and for the first time in years, there was no anger between them. Just the weight of all they had lost, and maybe a sliver of what they could still build. When he left the hospital, the boys were waiting for him at home, barefoot in pajamas, half wrapped in a blanket fort built between the couch and the dining room chairs. Liam had fallen asleep inside with a toy dragon tucked under his chin. Logan was drawing on the kitchen tiles with washable markers. Lucas stood guard, protective and serious, as always. When Nathan walked in, Lucas simply asked, "How is she?" "She's better," Nathan said. "She needs time. But she's going to be okay." Lucas didn't smile, but he nodded, and for a moment, that was more than enough. Later that night, after the dishes were cleared and the chaos had quieted, Nathan stood in the doorway of their room. He watched the 3 of them sleep again, now in matching pajamas someone from the staff had picked out, their faces soft with exhaustion. And he realized something: this was no longer a temporary arrangement. These boys weren't guests. They weren't his duty. They were home. And he would never let them go. Nathan's life transformed in ways he couldn't have predicted. Every day brought new, unexpected challenges. The penthouse, once a shrine to silence and sleek modernism, had become a chaotic, living organism. Toys were scattered across designer rugs. The kitchen counters were lined with cereal boxes, juice cartons, and snack wrappers. The marble floor echoed not with the sound of imported leather shoes but with bare feet and laughter, sometimes followed by tears and shouts of, "He started it." Nathan, who had once negotiated billion-dollar deals without flinching, now found himself crouched in the hallway trying to mediate a standoff over a broken crayon. Some days, he questioned everything. He questioned if he was good enough, if he had already failed them in ways he couldn't see. He worried about the damage done before he arrived. Nights they went to bed hungry, mornings they woke up alone. But more often than not, those doubts were silenced by small moments. Logan running to him with outstretched arms just because. Liam proudly showing him a drawing of Dad that looked more like a spaghetti monster in a tie. Lucas quietly setting aside the last piece of pizza for one of his brothers. These weren't grand victories, but they were signs. The boys were beginning to trust that this life might last. That this new version of family was real. Work didn't disappear, of course. The board still expected him to lead, investors still needed reassurance, and projects didn't pause just because Nathan Rivers was braiding hair and cleaning glitter off his conference table. He learned to delegate more, hired a chief of operations he trusted, and slowly let go of the idea that his worth depended on being everywhere at once. For the first time, he began to build his schedule around school pickups and bedtime stories, not closing bells and quarterly reports. Not everyone approved. When word began to spread among the upper circles of the business world, that Nathan Rivers, the sharpest mind in real estate, was now raising 3 children, reactions ranged from amusement to doubt. Some called it a midlife crisis. Others whispered about a PR stunt. But the harshest came from within. Garrett Vale, his former business partner, requested a meeting one morning under the guise of discussing a merger. They met in the lobby of Nathan's own hotel, but the tone was far from friendly. Garrett was all confidence and polished arrogance. He didn't waste time with pleasantries. "This thing you're doing," he said, gesturing vaguely as if fatherhood were an accessory Nathan had picked up, "it's costing you credibility. Investors want leaders, not full-time babysitters. You're turning your life into a nursery." Nathan listened in silence, letting Garrett talk. He watched him the way someone might watch an old ghost, familiar, but no longer frightening. When Garrett finished, waiting for rebuttal or apology, Nathan simply shook his head. "You don't get it," he said quietly. "You've never gotten it. This isn't a detour. It's the first real thing I've ever done." Garrett rolled his eyes. "You're emotional. This will wear off." "No," Nathan said, his voice steady. "This is who I am now. And if that makes some people nervous, they can walk." Later that day, Nathan formally dissolved their partnership. It cost him more than he wanted to admit: contracts, networks, investors. But he didn't hesitate. He had money. What he needed now was integrity. He restructured parts of the company, redirected resources to housing initiatives for single mothers, and hired women like Emily who had lived through circumstances most of his colleagues couldn't imagine. It wasn't about charity. It was about balance. About rebuilding something better with what he had left. That night, Lucas knocked on the study door and asked if Nathan could come see a science volcano they had built in the bathtub. Liam and Logan were already in their pajamas, holding spoons as if they were lab equipment. Nathan smiled, followed them into the bathroom, and knelt on the tile to help with the baking soda. As the foam erupted over the sides of the toy mountain, the boys shouted and laughed, and Nathan felt something crack open inside him, a joy so pure it felt almost undeserved. Later, after the cleanup, after bedtime books and water refills and one more hug, Nathan sat on the edge of his bed and stared out at the city below. For the first time in a long time, he didn't feel the need to chase anything. He wasn't running from regret. He wasn't trying to outpace failure. He was simply here. And that, he realized, was more than enough. Emily's recovery was slow and uncertain at first. The doctors were cautiously optimistic, but her body had taken a brutal toll from the weeks of neglect and untreated illness. The infection had cleared, but fatigue clung to her like fog, and even simple tasks, brushing her hair, sitting upright for more than 20 minutes, left her winded. Still, each day brought a little more strength. Nathan visited her often, never pushing, never asking more than she was ready to give. He would sit by her bedside, sometimes in silence, sometimes reading aloud updates from the boys, or just letting her watch him without pressure. There were moments when she'd look at him and he'd see the flicker of the woman he used to know, the stubborn spark, the humor she kept buried beneath the exhaustion. But there was caution too. And a deep, aching grief in her eyes that told him she didn't know if she would ever fully return. 3 weeks passed before she finally asked about the boys in more detail. Until then, it had always been surface level: are they eating, are they safe, are they sleeping? But on that day, she looked at him across the hospital room, her face pale but focused, and asked, "Do they smile when they wake up?" The question hit Nathan harder than he expected. He nodded. "Sometimes. Logan always does. Lucas pretends he doesn't, but I've seen him peek out from under the blanket with a grin when he thinks no one's looking. And Liam, he talks in his sleep. Says the funniest things. This morning he dreamed he was riding a llama made of jelly beans." Emily laughed softly, and for the first time, it sounded real. It cracked something open between them. They talked for longer that day, more than they had in years. She asked what bedtime was like, what they fought about, what foods they refused. Nathan told her everything, not embellishing, not trying to impress, just being honest. He told her how Lucas guarded the other two like a miniature adult, how Logan sometimes got sad at night but wouldn't say why, and how Liam had started calling Nathan Dad, without ceremony, like it was the most natural word in the world. He told her how scared he was. How much he wanted to get it right. How much he already loved them. Emily listened quietly, then said, "You're doing better than I ever did. I was just surviving." Nathan didn't let her retreat into guilt. "You kept them alive," he said. "You gave them love. That's more than I knew how to do before they walked into my life." Another week passed, and she was discharged from the hospital, not fully healed, but stable, capable of walking and managing basic things on her own. Nathan offered to bring her home, but she declined. Not yet. She needed space. She needed to feel strong before facing them again. Instead, she moved into a small, temporary apartment nearby, paid for without fanfare by Nathan, and began physical therapy and counseling. She insisted on doing as much of it alone as she could. He didn't fight her on it. He understood. Strength, for Emily, had never meant loud declarations. It meant getting up again. Quietly. With purpose. Then came the day she was ready. It was early spring, the air warm and full of birdsong. The boys were playing in the schoolyard after class, under the supervision of one of Nathan's staff, while he stood nearby watching from a bench, sipping lukewarm coffee. He hadn't told them she was coming. Emily had asked for that, no expectations, no drama, just a moment of truth. She walked into the playground slowly, unsure of how her legs would carry her, unsure what they'd say, unsure if they'd even recognize her after everything. They did. Lucas spotted her first, froze, and then said nothing. He didn't shout. He didn't run. He just looked. Liam turned next and blinked as if unsure whether it was a dream. Logan gasped and dropped the toy car he was holding. And then, slowly, as if pulled by some invisible thread, the three of them walked to her. No words. Just three small bodies pressing into her at once, arms wrapping around her waist and shoulders and face, and Emily crumbling in the middle of them, tears streaming down her cheeks. They clung to her as if afraid she'd vanish again. Nathan stood back, watching the scene unfold with something tight and painful in his chest. But not painful in a bad way. It was the kind of ache that came with hope, with healing. With knowing something had been broken, but now, slowly, against all odds, was mending. When Emily finally looked up, her eyes found Nathan's. She said nothing. She didn't have to. Everything she felt was there in her expression. Gratitude. Regret. Relief. And a quiet, cautious belief that maybe this story wasn't over. Maybe it had just begun. A full year had passed since the day Nathan found the boys on that hotel terrace, and in that time, his world had reshaped itself entirely. What once had been a life defined by sharp suits, rigid routines, and boardroom victories had softened into something far messier, infinitely more chaotic, and deeply human. His penthouse no longer resembled the pristine, impersonal space it used to be. It had been taken over by the vibrant evidence of childhood, walls taped with drawings, shelves overflowing with books about dinosaurs and space, a never-ending trail of mismatched socks, and the occasional sticky handprint on a window he no longer rushed to clean. He had learned things in the last 12 months he'd never thought he'd care to know: how to braid hair for Spirit Week, because Liam liked his fancy pirate look, the exact temperature to warm chicken nuggets so Logan wouldn't complain, and the names of all 3 teachers at the boys' school. He knew the routes to and from soccer practice, how to fake excitement during puppet shows, and the correct way to fold a blanket according to Lucas's very specific system. And somewhere along the way, without any announcement or moment of clarity, he had become a father, not just in title, but in presence, in instinct, in love. Emily had stayed close, slowly rebuilding her life with the same quiet determination she had used to hold it together all those years. She didn't move in with them, not yet, but she came over for dinners, joined weekend trips to the park, and sat next to Nathan at school plays. They had learned how to coexist again, not as the people they used to be, but as something new, co-parents, yes, but also something softer. There were no grand gestures or promises. Only consistency. Honesty. Forgiveness in the form of patience. On one sunny afternoon, as spring settled into full bloom, Nathan found himself sitting beside Emily on a bench in the park. The boys were running in chaotic circles around a flock of confused pigeons, their laughter carrying over the breeze like music. Emily leaned back against the bench, her face turned toward the sun, her eyes closed. Nathan watched her for a moment, then turned his gaze toward the boys. "They're different now," she said, without opening her eyes. "Happier. Lighter." "They are," he agreed. "So am I." She looked at him then, her eyes clear and steady. "You did this, Nathan. You gave them something I couldn't anymore." He shook his head slowly. "You brought them into the world. You kept them alive. You did more than I ever did." "I gave them love," she said. "But you gave them peace. And safety. And their dad." He was quiet after that, unsure how to respond. So much still felt fragile between them, but it was no longer painful. It was just real. Earned. Then, after a long pause, he looked at her and said, "Thank you. For finding your way to me, even if it took everything you had." She smiled faintly. "You should be thanking them. They brought you back to life." And in that moment, he realized she was right. The boys hadn't just shown up at his hotel that day. They had pulled him out of a life that looked successful on the surface but had been hollow underneath. They had taught him that love wasn't about grand gestures or perfection. It was about showing up, day after day, with your whole heart, even when you were scared, even when you didn't have all the answers. As the sun began to set and the boys finally tired themselves out, Logan climbed onto Nathan's lap, curling into his chest with the trust of a child who had finally stopped wondering whether someone would catch him. Liam leaned against Emily's side, humming a nonsense song, while Lucas remained a step behind, always watching, always guarding, but no longer wary. Nathan wrapped his arms around Logan and looked out over the grass, where the last light of the day shimmered across the trees. He felt full. Not with power. Not with success. But with something far rarer. Wholeness. For the first time in his life, he wasn't chasing anything. He wasn't proving anything. He was exactly where he needed to be. And as the boys started arguing about what movie to watch that night, Nathan just smiled, stood, and said, "Let's go home." Because now, home wasn't a place. It was them. Nick Harper was certain that nothing could break through the fortress of control he had spent years building, until he saw a man yelling at 3 terrified little girls. Nick Harper didn't believe in fate, emotion, or second chances. As the CEO of one of the largest logistics empires in the country, he had built his life with cold precision and expected the world to operate under the same rules. He had grown up learning that weakness wasn't forgiven, that vulnerability had a cost, and that feelings slowed down success. So he locked them away, every tender instinct, every memory that threatened to stir regret, every name that used to mean something. His life ran like clockwork, morning briefings, private jets, silent black coffee, meetings stacked back to back. He had a calendar filled 6 months in advance and a staff who filtered the world for him. Efficiency was his only compass. That morning was supposed to be the same. Just a routine visit to a private clinic for a standard executive health check. A quick scan, a signature, and back to the office. But as he stepped out of his sleek black car, flanked by security and assistants, he heard something that didn't belong in his carefully controlled world, the sharp, angry voice of a man yelling. Nick paused. It came from near the entrance, harsh words echoing off the stone wall. As he moved toward the source, he saw him, a man in his 40s, broad-shouldered, aggressive posture, dark hair cut roughly. And in front of him were 3 small girls. Blonde. Thin. Probably around 6 years old. They stood huddled together, too scared to speak, wide brown eyes full of panic and silence. Their hands were clenched at their sides, their small bodies stiff as boards. Nick watched as the man barked at them again, calling them ungrateful, stupid, asking why they couldn't just do what he said. None of them responded. They just stared at the ground, faces pale, shrinking under the weight of his voice. Something unfamiliar twisted in Nick's chest, a pressure he hadn't felt in years. He didn't understand it at first. He only knew he couldn't walk past it. He approached slowly but directly, and when the man noticed him, his voice dropped but his aggression didn't. "Nothing to see here," the man muttered. "Family stuff." Nick didn't stop. "That's not how you talk to children," he said quietly, but with enough weight to still the air between them. The man bristled. "Who the hell are you?" Nick didn't answer. Instead, he turned to the girls. One was trembling. Another had tears in her eyes but hadn't let them fall. The third just stared up at him with something unreadable, something like hope, or maybe just desperation. And then the man made a mistake. He grabbed one of the girls by the arm and pulled her sharply toward him. Nick's voice was calm, but his expression was like stone. "Let her go. Now." Security had already moved closer. Nick raised a hand to stop them. He wanted to handle this himself. The man let go with a snarl and stepped back. Nick crouched down to the girl's level. "It's okay. You're safe now," he said, not even knowing if that was true. They didn't speak, but one of them, tiny and shaking, reached out and grabbed his sleeve. And in that moment, he knew he couldn't leave them. He asked their names. They spoke softly, "Emma. Claire. Sophie." He asked where their mother was. Claire answered this time, "She's in the hospital. She got sick last night. We waited outside because Mommy said if something bad happens, someone will come." Someone. Nick swallowed hard. Then the man behind him scoffed. "Their mother's in intensive care. I'm her husband. And she never could raise them right." Nick stood, slowly, turned to face him. "Your behavior suggests you shouldn't be near them. I'll be speaking to hospital security and staff about this." The man protested, cursed, threatened, but within minutes, he was surrounded by hospital personnel and escorted away. The girls stayed close to Nick, their trust hesitant but growing with each second. And as they looked up at him, wide-eyed and waiting, he realized he had no plan, no script. But he couldn't walk away. Something inside him refused. And then, as the nurse walked over with an update, she said the name he hadn't heard in 7 years, their mother, Sarah Wells, is still in critical condition. The world tilted under his feet. Sarah. The one woman he had walked away from because he thought she deserved better than a man chained to ambition. The woman he had never stopped thinking about. The mother of these girls. And suddenly, everything Nick thought he knew about his life, his rules, and his past began to unravel. Nick followed the nurse into the hospital, the three girls staying close behind him like shadows, their small hands clinging to the hem of his coat. He wasn't used to people depending on him for anything but results or decisions. He had never been someone's safe place. And yet, as they walked through sterile white halls under the glare of fluorescent lights, he became acutely aware that they trusted him, these three girls who didn't even know his name. He didn't deserve their trust. He hadn't earned it. But they gave it anyway, maybe because they had no other choice. They were brought to a quiet waiting room outside the ICU, far from the noise and motion of the main floor. The nurse explained that Sarah had been rushed in during the night, internal bleeding, an emergency surgery, then a medically induced coma. Her vitals were stable now, but there was no timeline for her waking. Nick listened, nodding slowly, though the words didn't quite register the way they should have. All he could think about was her name, the last time he'd seen her, the way she had looked at him that night when he left and didn't look back. The girls climbed onto the couch and huddled together. They didn't cry. They were quiet in a way that only came from children who had learned how to manage themselves too early. Nick sat in the chair across from them and studied their faces, their mannerisms. It was eerie, almost painful, how much they resembled Sarah. The hair was different, but the eyes, those deep, expressive brown eyes, were unmistakably hers. And in some strange, undeniable way, he saw something of himself too. It wasn't something he could prove yet, but it was there. In the way Claire tilted her head when she was thinking. In the way Sophie stayed alert while pretending not to look. In Emma's stubborn silence. It unnerved him. It made him question everything. Eventually, the nurse brought in apple juice and a box of crackers, and the girls whispered thank you without being asked. Nick realized they had been trained to make themselves small, to cause no trouble, to not expect much. That realization twisted something in his chest. When had that started? And how had Sarah let this man, whoever he was, husband or not, become part of their lives? Nick turned to the nurse. Is there any family listed in her file? Anyone besides him? The nurse checked the chart and shook her head. Only the girls. No emergency contacts, no next of kin. Just a note that says, if anything happens, please look after my daughters. She looked up, hesitating slightly. And she added a name. Yours. Nick blinked. She put my name down. She did, the nurse confirmed. You're the only one. He leaned back in the chair, stunned. Sarah hadn't spoken to him in over 7 years. They hadn't exchanged a word since the day he left. And still, in what might have been her last conscious act, she had thought of him. Chosen him. Trusted him. It was too much. He stood and walked down the hallway to clear his head. He didn't cry. He didn't panic. But inside, something was shifting rapidly. This wasn't just a coincidence. This wasn't some passing moment of nostalgia or guilt. This was real. These were her daughters. And she had left them with him, at least for now. When he returned to the waiting room, the girls were asleep, curled together like kittens on the couch. One of them had her hand wrapped around the hem of his coat, still holding on even in her dreams. He sat down beside them, more carefully this time, and exhaled slowly. He didn't know what he was supposed to do next. He didn't know what kind of father he could be, if he was one at all. But he knew one thing for certain. He wasn't going to disappear. Not this time. The next morning began not with alarms or meetings, but with the quiet stirrings of 3 little girls in a hotel suite that had never hosted children before. Nick had booked the top-floor suite of a 5-star hotel across from the hospital without thinking twice. It was the only place nearby with full-time service, and he couldn't stand the idea of the girls waiting alone in a hospital lounge. He arranged for fresh clothes, child-friendly meals, and even toys, though he had no idea what 6-year-old girls actually liked. When the concierge asked if they were his daughters, he didn't correct her. Not because he was sure, but because denying it felt wrong. He stood by the window that morning, dressed in a shirt he hadn't ironed himself in years, sipping coffee that tasted like little. He watched the sunrise stretch across the city skyline, but his thoughts were somewhere else entirely. In the other room, he could hear quiet voices, Sophie asking where their mom was, Emma reading out loud from a cereal box, Claire insisting her sock had disappeared. It was domestic chaos in miniature, and somehow it felt more grounding than any board meeting ever had. After breakfast, he dressed the girls as best he could and brought them back to the hospital. The nurses greeted them with warm familiarity, already recognizing the 3 tiny sisters with serious eyes and matching braids. Nick held the elevator door as the girls filed in, each carrying something, Emma with a drawing, Claire with a small stuffed bear, and Sophie clutching a folded note she had written for her mother. None of them asked if she was awake yet. They just looked at the closed ICU door like it held their entire world. Inside the waiting room, Nick met with a hospital social worker. The woman had kind eyes but spoke with quiet firmness, asking the kinds of questions that made him sit straighter. Did he have any legal custody? Did he know the children's medical histories? Did he have proof of paternity? Nick didn't lie. He told her the truth. He didn't know yet if he was their biological father, but he was certain Sarah had listed him as an emergency contact, and the children clearly trusted him. He offered to pay for a paternity test that day. She agreed but made it clear that the process might take time. Later that afternoon, when the girls had fallen asleep curled up on chairs in the sunlit corner of the waiting room, Nick walked down to the lab for the test. He held the swabs in his hands like they were heavier than they were, and when the technician took the samples, he didn't flinch. He didn't know what result he wanted. In some part of him, he already knew. It was written on their faces. When he returned upstairs, Claire stirred in her sleep and reached for him in a way that felt instinctive. He sat beside her and stayed there, unmoving, as she settled against his side. His arm wrapped around her without thought, and she let out a tiny sigh. Something sharp and unfamiliar burned behind his eyes. He didn't cry. But it felt close. By evening, he called his assistant and cancelled the rest of his week. Then the next. For the first time in his adult life, Nick Harper had cleared his calendar completely, not for an emergency board meeting or an international crisis, but for 3 little girls who might be his daughters and a woman in a hospital bed who might still need him. That night, after dinner and teeth brushing and goodnight stories, the girls lay side by side in the large hotel bed. Just as he was about to leave the room, Sophie sat up and asked softly, "If Mama stays asleep, will you stay with us?" Nick paused in the doorway. He turned around and walked back to her, kneeling beside the bed. "Yes," he said simply. "No matter what happens, I'll stay." Sophie looked at her sisters, then nodded and lay back down. And in that moment, Nick realized something had already changed. Whether the test came back positive or not, whether Sarah woke tomorrow or weeks from now, he had already made his choice. He wasn't going anywhere. The DNA results arrived 3 days later. Nick had been sitting in the hospital cafeteria, pretending to read emails on his tablet while the girls napped upstairs in the family lounge. The call came quietly, without drama or build-up, just a soft vibration in his pocket and a voice on the other end confirming what he already felt in his bones. 99.9% probability. He was their biological father. Emma, Claire, and Sophie weren't just echoes of someone he once loved. They were his. Flesh and blood. His daughters. The call ended, but he didn't move. He sat there, staring blankly at the untouched cup of coffee in front of him, not sure whether to laugh, cry, or run. He had built empires, negotiated billion-dollar contracts, survived financial storms that ruined other men, but nothing had ever felt as heavy, as terrifying, or as right as this. The weight of responsibility pressed down on his chest, but not in a way that suffocated. It grounded him. He stood slowly and made his way back to the ICU floor. When he entered the lounge, the girls looked up from the puzzle they were piecing together on the carpet. They didn't ask for news, not about test results or anything else. But they looked at him with those wide, watchful eyes, as if some part of them already knew. He sat down beside them and placed a hand gently on Claire's back. "I got some important news," he said, keeping his voice soft. "It's about you and me." Sophie tilted her head. "Did the hospital lady tell you if you're our dad?" Nick nodded. "She did. And I am." Emma didn't say anything. She just crawled into his lap, rested her head against his chest, and whispered, "I already thought you were." Nick didn't know how long he sat there, holding all three of them, his heart full and fragile at once. They didn't ask what it meant. They didn't ask if he'd be staying. They just knew. And so did he. Later that evening, he stood outside Sarah's hospital room and watched through the glass as machines beeped steadily beside her. Tubes and wires ran across her pale skin, and her chest rose and fell in quiet rhythm. She looked small in the bed, worn down by everything life had thrown at her. But she was still fighting. He remembered the way she used to laugh with her whole face, how fiercely she loved, how she never backed down. Even now, unconscious, she had managed to protect her children, and lead them back to him. Nick stepped inside the room, closing the door quietly behind him. He pulled the chair closer to her bed and sat down. He wasn't a man of long speeches, but the silence between them ached with things that had gone unsaid for too long. "You were right," he said quietly, staring at her motionless hand. "I was afraid. I thought I could walk away clean. That you'd be better off. That I wasn't meant for any of this. But I was wrong. You were braver than I ever gave you credit for. You did this alone. You raised them. You carried all the weight I should have helped you hold." His throat tightened, but he forced himself to keep going. "They're perfect. You would be so proud of them. And I don't know what happens next, if you wake up tomorrow or in a month or not at all, but I promise you, I'm here now. And I'm not leaving again." He reached out and carefully slid his hand over hers, his fingers wrapping gently around her limp ones. He didn't expect a miracle. He didn't expect her to open her eyes. But for the first time since the day he walked away from her years ago, he felt like he was doing something right. That night, when he returned to the hotel with the girls, something in the atmosphere had shifted. They were louder now, more playful. They laughed at his terrible attempt to make grilled cheese and insisted on brushing his hair after dinner, claiming he had CEO hair that needed fixing. He let them. He let it all happen. He let himself feel the joy, the mess, the overwhelming noise of family life he had once thought he was too broken to want. And when he tucked them in and kissed each forehead, he whispered the same words to all three, "You're safe. I'm here." And he meant it with everything he had. Morning arrived with streaks of golden light pouring through the hotel windows, casting soft warmth across the room where three little girls stirred beneath rumpled blankets. Nick had been awake for hours, not out of habit but because his thoughts refused to let him rest. He had made life-altering decisions in boardrooms, under time pressure, with millions at stake, but nothing had prepared him for the quiet magnitude of this moment. He was a father now. Officially. Unquestionably. And though the truth had rooted itself in his heart the moment Sophie first reached for his sleeve outside the hospital, the weight of confirmation had settled over him like both a responsibility and a gift. He made breakfast again, toast that came out too dark, scrambled eggs that were too soft, but the girls didn't complain. They just giggled, added their own sugar to the juice, and told him they liked when he cooked like a beginner. Emma brought him a drawing with 4 stick figures, 3 girls, and 1 taller figure in a suit and tie, smiling with messy brown scribbles for hair. "That's you," she said. "But we couldn't draw the hotel, so we drew hearts instead." After breakfast, they returned to the hospital. The nurses greeted them like family now. Sophie handed over her daily drawing for her mom. Today it was a sun and a flower growing out of a heart. Nick stood outside Sarah's room and stared through the glass again, hoping for change but preparing himself for stillness. She hadn't stirred since her surgery. The doctors said she was stable but still in a coma, and the word felt heavier each time he heard it. Yet he came anyway. Every day. He told her about the girl's antics, about what Sophie had whispered in her sleep, about how Emma bossed everyone around with quiet authority, and how Claire had a habit of sneaking extra cookies when no one was watching. Sometimes he just sat in silence, holding her hand. That afternoon, the hospital's child protection caseworker asked to speak with him privately. She had reviewed the DNA confirmation, Sarah's medical file, and his own background. She spoke cautiously, measuring her tone as she brought up temporary guardianship. Technically, he still didn't have legal custody, and the girls were considered at risk due to the absence of a conscious parent and the previously reported abuse by Sarah's husband. Nick listened quietly, his jaw tightening at the mention of that man, the one who had yelled at them, the one who called them a burden. He pushed down the fire in his chest and asked what he needed to do. The paperwork was extensive, the interviews scheduled quickly, and home evaluations required. Nick didn't hesitate. He gave his full cooperation. He handed over documents, submitted to background checks, opened his home. For the first time in his life, someone else's needs eclipsed his own, and he didn't try to fight it. His staff didn't recognize this version of him, one who skipped meetings, who missed quarterly briefings, who told his assistant, "Clear my schedule. I've got something more important now." The girls noticed too. They began to smile more easily, sleep more soundly. They no longer asked what would happen tomorrow, because Nick had already answered it with every action. He brushed their hair in the morning, read to them at night, held their hands when they walked through the hospital halls. He didn't need to declare his love for them, they lived it with him, hour by hour. One night, as they returned to the hotel after another visit, Claire slipped her hand into his as they crossed the lobby. "When Mommy wakes up," she said softly, "will you still stay with us?" Nick knelt beside her, looked her straight in the eyes, and said, "I'm not going anywhere. Even when she wakes up. Even when things change." Claire nodded solemnly, then hugged him with both arms around his neck. And in that embrace, Nick felt something settle in his chest, a calmness, a belonging. Not the fleeting high of victory or profit, but the steady, unshakable kind of peace that came from being exactly where you were meant to be. He tucked them in that night, kissed their foreheads, and sat by the window long after they had fallen asleep. He stared out at the city, the same skyline that once represented power, distance, control. Now it looked smaller somehow. Less important. Because the most valuable part of his life was sleeping in the next room, and for the first time, he didn't feel the need to chase anything else. A week passed. The girls had begun calling the hotel home, though Nick had already started preparing something better, a real home, not just a temporary sanctuary with room service. He'd hired an architect to convert the upper floor of his townhouse into a dedicated space for the girls, complete with 3 bedrooms and a sunlit playroom. He had never considered what a child needed in a home before, but now every detail mattered. The carpet had to be soft enough for bare feet. The paint colors had to feel warm, not cold. The windows had to open wide enough for light and laughter to get in. He surprised himself with how much he cared. His assistant, long used to his detached efficiency, barely hid her disbelief when he asked her to order a shelf full of bedtime storybooks instead of spreadsheets and legal reports. Sarah remained unconscious. Each day, Nick sat beside her, reading from the journal he had begun to keep. He wrote down everything he noticed about the girls, the way Emma organized everything into neat little piles, how Claire sang to herself when she thought no one was listening, how Sophie had started calling him Dad when she thought he couldn't hear her. The pages filled quickly, and he hoped that one day, when she opened her eyes, she'd be able to read through them and know her daughters had been safe, protected, loved. One evening, after a long day of hospital visits, forms, and yet another meeting with social services, Nick returned to the hotel room to find all three girls waiting by the window, their faces lit by the golden hour glow. They had drawn him another picture. This one showed a big house with 4 stick figures outside, holding hands. Above the house were the words, "Our family," written in uneven block letters. Without hesitation, he crouched down, opened his arms, and let them wrap around him in a tangle of limbs and laughter. No one had ever made him feel like this before, not colleagues, not awards, not success. Just these girls, who had every reason to be afraid, and yet chose to trust him. That night, something shifted. After bedtime stories and a failed attempt at French braids, Nick returned to the hospital alone. The halls were quieter than usual, the overhead lights dimmed to a soft glow. He stood at Sarah's door for a moment before walking in, the hum of machines greeting him like background music to a life suspended. He sat beside her, took her hand in his, and began to speak softly. "I never asked to be a father. You know that. And maybe I wouldn't have been ready, even if you told me all those years ago. I thought I had to protect my ambition, protect the version of myself I worked so hard to build. But now, everything I thought mattered, it's nothing compared to them. I know you were scared, too. I know you did what you thought was right. But you were never alone, Sarah. You didn't have to be. And now I'm here. I'm not running from this. Not anymore." He paused, and for a moment, the silence in the room felt heavier than before. The steady rhythm of the heart monitor was the only answer. Until her fingers moved. It was subtle, just the twitch of her pinky against his palm, but it was enough. Nick froze, eyes wide, heart suddenly pounding. He leaned forward, watching her face, praying he hadn't imagined it. Then, slowly, painfully, her eyelids fluttered open. She blinked several times, confused, dazed, and then her gaze focused on him. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. She didn't seem surprised to see him. Only relieved. Her lips moved, dry and slow. "You stayed," she whispered. Nick nodded, a rush of emotion catching in his throat. "I stayed." Tears pooled in her eyes, but they didn't fall. She squeezed his hand with what little strength she had. "Are they, okay?" "They're more than okay," he said. "They're amazing. And they're waiting for you." He didn't leave her side that night. He sat there for hours, even after she fell asleep again. He didn't call the doctors right away. He wanted that moment to belong to just them, before the world came rushing back in. And in the quiet glow of the ICU, he felt it deep in his soul, something irrevocable had changed. Not just in Sarah, not just in the girls, but in him. He had found the one thing he never knew he was searching for. A reason to stay. A reason to live for something beyond himself. A family. The news of Sarah waking up spread quickly through the hospital. Doctors came in and out, checking vitals, adjusting medications, whispering in clipped, efficient tones. But for Nick, none of it mattered more than the fact that her eyes had opened, that she had seen him, that she had asked about the girls. He remained by her side throughout the morning, answering her quiet, breathless questions in small pieces so she wouldn't grow overwhelmed. Her voice was still weak, but her memory was sharp. She remembered the night she collapsed, remembered the pain, the confusion, and most importantly, she remembered writing his name on the hospital forms. She had hoped, barely conscious at the time, that someone might call him if the worst happened. She hadn't known if he would come. But he had. Sarah's recovery was going to be slow. The doctors warned that her mobility might take time to return, that she'd need physical therapy and monitored care. Nick didn't flinch. He asked for recommendations, made calls to specialists, arranged for in-home care before she even asked. But she didn't ask for anything. In fact, when he offered to move her into the townhouse once she was released, she hesitated. They sat together one evening in her hospital room, the girls asleep in the lounge down the hall. Nick had brought photos, drawings the girls had made that week, blurry pictures of their first visit to the playground near his building, a note from Sophie that said, "We miss you, Mommy, but Daddy is very good at stories." Sarah looked at the note for a long time before setting it gently in her lap. "They call you Daddy," she said softly, her voice still hoarse. "I didn't tell them to," Nick replied. "It just started one day. And I didn't stop it." Sarah smiled faintly, but there was something else in her eyes. "Do they know who you used to be? The man who left before any of this ever started?" "They know I wasn't there," he answered honestly. "But they don't need that story yet. All they care about is that I'm here now." Sarah nodded slowly. "And are you? Are you really here? Because once I leave this hospital, things get real. They ask questions. They cling. They get scared. They break down for no reason. And they love without conditions." "I know," he said. "And that's what scares me the most. Because I don't want to let them down." "You won't," she whispered, then looked down at her hands. "But you might let yourself down if you run again." He took a breath, then reached for her hand, holding it gently. "I'm not running. Not from them. Not from you. Not from the life I could have had if I'd stayed." She didn't cry. Neither did he. But they sat there a long time, her hand in his, the silence between them no longer heavy with regret, but filled with the weight of possibility. 3 days later, Sarah was released into Nick's care. She wasn't strong enough to walk far, but she didn't need to. His townhouse, once cold and lifeless, had transformed into a living space filled with warmth, laughter, and small chaos. The girls ran through the halls barefoot, leaving trails of toys and ribbons. They helped unpack their mother's things and insisted she use the biggest pillow. Emma led the welcome tour, explaining which shelves were for bedtime books and which drawer had the best pajamas. Claire cried the first night Sarah was home, not from fear, but from relief. Sophie held her mother's hand as she fell asleep and whispered, "We knew you'd come back." Sarah sat on the couch later that evening, legs curled under a blanket, watching her daughters play with Nick on the floor. He was letting them tie ribbons in his hair while trying to help them build a paper castle. He looked up at her and smiled, that quiet, new smile that had begun to replace the one she remembered from years ago. The girls shouted and cheered as the tower finally stood. Sarah reached for her tea and leaned back, letting the moment settle into her. Everything had changed, her body, her strength, her trust, but somehow, what had felt broken for so long was being pieced back together by small hands and unexpected grace. This wasn't the life either of them had planned. But it was the one that was meant to be. Spring arrived slowly, as if unsure it was allowed to return, but when it came, it brought soft sunlight through open windows, the scent of fresh rain on pavement, and a kind of peace that had once seemed impossible. It had been 3 months since Sarah came home, and in that time, everything in Nick's world had reshaped itself around a new center, one built not on power or ambition, but on presence, patience, and love. The townhouse, once pristine and quiet, now hummed with the rhythm of family. The walls echoed with footsteps and giggles, with the sound of bedtime stories and cereal bowls clinking in the morning. The furniture had shifted too, sharp edges were padded, the coffee table replaced by an art easel, and the dining room chairs regularly held dolls and toy dinosaurs alongside real people. Nick had stepped back from day-to-day control of his company. At first, the board pushed back, worried about leadership, about image, about continuity. But he stood firm. He no longer measured success in quarterly gains but in the way Emma smiled when he helped her solve a puzzle, or how Claire climbed into his lap during thunderstorms, or how Sophie leaned on his shoulder in silence and sighed like she'd found her safe place. His business didn't collapse. It adapted. And so did he. Sarah regained strength faster than the doctors predicted. Physical therapy sessions turned from struggle to progress, and soon she was walking without assistance, her movements slower than before but just as deliberate. She reclaimed her role as mother with ease and grace, but not in isolation. She let Nick share the burden and the joy. They operated as a team now, passing routines back and forth without resentment. Their relationship wasn't perfect, but it was honest. They had hard conversations in the quiet hours, shared long looks over the heads of giggling children, and held hands when the day left them both overwhelmed. No one asked for guarantees. They just kept choosing each other. One sunny afternoon, the family gathered at the small garden behind the townhouse. The girls had decorated it with streamers and paper flowers, insisting it was a celebration day. No one could quite explain what the celebration was for. There was no official holiday, no birthday, but everyone agreed it felt like one. Sarah sat on a bench in the shade, her legs tucked under her, watching as the girls ran barefoot through the grass, their laughter rising like music. Nick stood by the grill, wearing an apron someone had jokingly gifted him that read, "CEO of the barbecue." He looked ridiculous and knew it, but when Claire threw her arms around his waist and called him, the best dad ever, he didn't care about appearances. After lunch, the girls put on a small performance. They had written a play, completely chaotic, full of costume changes and missed lines, but it ended with all three of them shouting, "And that's why we love our family," before taking a dramatic bow. Everyone clapped, and Sophie turned to Sarah with a shy smile. "We made it for you. Because you're our favorite person." Then she turned to Nick. "But he's our hero." Nick knelt to their level, pulling them into a hug so tight it made them squeal. Sarah walked over and placed her hand gently on his shoulder. He looked up at her, and for a moment, the world seemed to still around them. Not in the way that demanded silence, but in a way that made space for everything they had endured and everything they had become. That evening, after the girls had fallen asleep in a fort made of couch cushions and blankets, Nick and Sarah sat on the back steps, watching the sun dip low. She leaned her head on his shoulder. They didn't speak for a while. There was nothing to explain, no need to relive what had already healed. Finally, she whispered, "I didn't think we'd get here." "I didn't either," he said. "But I'm glad we did." He looked out at the yard, at the paper flowers swaying in the breeze, at the soft glow of string lights wrapped around the porch railing. This wasn't the life he had imagined when he was younger, when success meant silence and solitude and clean lines. This life was messy. Loud. Full. Unpredictable. But it was also the most real thing he had ever known. Nick reached for her hand and held it tightly. They had come through fire. They had faced absence, regret, uncertainty, and fear. But in the end, they had built something together, something neither of them had dared to dream before it was almost lost. Not a perfect life. A whole one. This story's ending feels like a quiet triumph, not because everything turns out perfectly, but because the characters earn every step toward healing and connection. Nick's transformation isn't sudden or exaggerated, it's honest. He doesn't become a flawless father or partner overnight, but he shows up, again and again, even when it's hard. That's what makes the ending powerful, it's grounded in real emotion, not fantasy. The final scenes don't wrap life in a neat bow, they reveal a deeper truth. Family isn't built by blood alone, or by grand gestures, but by the small, consistent moments of presence and choice. The paper flowers, the makeshift play, the porch conversations, they are the proof that love grows in the mess, not outside of it. What began with indifference ends with deep belonging, and in that transformation lies the story's heart. It reminds us that no one is too far gone to begin again.